We have come a long way in the past 2 years. We really kicked things off in March of 2012 where we had a board workshop, really started soliciting your input and feedback on a lot of different topics, and funding was that major topic. What is the funding approach and what is the population land use approach that we wanted to use for this long-range plan? The 2030 long-range plan, that we adopted about 5 years ago was a really aggressive plan both on land use and on the funding side as well. But we wanted to make sure we wanted to confirm that, or if there was a difference in direction, to make sure we got it from the very beginning. And we really did receive a different direction. The transit emphasis was still a major focus and something of importance. Population growth was going to continue to grow, and we're seeing major growth throughout the region over the lifetime of the plan, especially within Osceola County, over 100%. But when it came to funding, that's where things changed. We had our vision. We said we want a lot of transit and we want to build our communities, smart growth, and with transit being a key component of that. But when it came to funding, we were really relying on existing sources, existing revenues, and with that being said, that has a major impact on projects. We have a vision in one, and a kind of upward vision, but then we have a funding direction, which is kind of a down, more in the downward direction. So with that, we've covered, like I mentioned, a lot of topics in over the past 2 years. In each of the topics I'm going to cover today, we've had separate and distinct presentations on, so I'm not going to spend too much time on funding, but I do want to make some specific clarifications and call attention to some items. When it comes to funding, this is how transportation's funded. It's as simple as this. But really what I want to call attention to is the majority of our transportation funding sources, both on the capital and operations side, relate to fuel and relate to gas consumption. 12 of the 22 sources do relate to fuel. When it comes to local sources, there are some other options, whether it's sales tax or impact fees or dedicated general revenue funds. But the majority of those funds do relate to gas. And when there's declining gas sales and a declining consumption of fuel, we really need to say, is this the right funding program to make our transportation vision happen? So it comes from the three major funding sources, the federal monies, our state funding sources, local as well. But it is really important to call attention to our toll facilities and the work of the expressway authorities over really the past 20 to 30 years in this region. A lot of capital, a lot of major facilities, and a lot of connections have been made around the region because of our ability to bond and really advance and expedite those projects. But when it comes to the federal funds, we had the Secretary of Transportation in a while back, and he was here to say, we're running dry. Our program is insolvent. And with that being said, our reliance on federal and state sources, we really do need to be cautious on those commitments, on those matching funds. For the long-range plan, we do use funding assumptions and guidelines provided by Federal Highway. So we are able to assume the funding coming in from our federal and state partners. But practically speaking, if they're running an insolvent program, it should be alarming, and we really need to focus on local funds if we really want to see our transportation vision implemented. So when it comes to federal and state sources, you have the three counties, and this is really a return on gas tax receipts. So that's where you're seeing the monies from Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties. TMA funds, you've probably heard those as SU or XU funds. Those are the funds that come directly to the board for us being an MPO or a transportation management area. And those funds, our board does have the policy to split them amongst the modes. When it comes to the transportation alternative funds, that's a new funding category, or I guess a combination of past funding sources kind of grouped into transportation alternatives with MAP 21. The board's policy on that funding category really funds our bicycle and pedestrian, our active transportation program. But when it comes to federal and state funds over the 21 period, over the lifetime of the plan, we're looking at about $2.1, $2.2 billion. But with that being said, if things don't change at the federal level, who knows if that will come true. I mentioned local funding sources are a critical aspect of the long-range plan, and here's how we're assuming. We've had a lot of discussions with the board and also with the committees as it relates to funding sources. What funding sources are we going to assume, and when, and how much will they generate, and how do we want to spend those funds? Just to kind of go through here, just so there's for clarification purposes, where you see red zeros, those are funds that are available or not utilized. Black zeros don't mean that there's no money coming in. It's that they're going to more maintenance projects, kind of the resurfacing program. So there are money being generated from those funding sources, but aren't being allocated to capital improvements. As you will see, and as I mentioned early on, we really, got the direction from the board to say, existing resources, a very conservative funding approach. I will say Osceola County has a very aggressive approach. And with that, when we go back to projects, there's a direct correlation to their funding and the types of projects and their ability to implement premium types of projects. As you can see, whether it's their dedicated ad valorem, which is kind of a tax increment financing, and maybe one of the Osceola County members wants to maybe provide some clarification to that, but it's basically a general fund pitch that goes directly to transportation. And then they're also assuming the infrastructure sales tax as well as the charter county, which is really the sales tax, which really allows us to operate, build, and maintain transit, especially at a premium level. So as you see across the bottom, 1.9, almost $2 billion over the lifetime of the plan for Orange County based on basically their existing funding sources. 4.6 from Osceola, really relying heavily on the charter county as well as on the dedicated ad valorem. And then, it's about $787 million from Seminole County, which includes the infrastructure sales tax, which will be determined here in the next week or so. City of Orlando also has revenue source. They really dedicate a lot of these to their transit program, and we can really see the creation and really expansion of links in being really based upon their dedication of funds there. Over the lifetime of the plan, this is kind of all revenue, kind of a general summary of all the funds, but not all funding sources are created equally. There's strings attached and eligibility requirements for each and every funding source. So during the next sections, I'm going to talk about how we're splitting that $15 billion over the lifetime of the plan, but that can't be all spent exactly how we want it. So there are some strings, as I mentioned.
We should call attention to that $15 billion figure. For the plan that was approved back in 2009 for the year 2030, that number was a little over $19 billion. So it's important for the board to understand that we have been very mindful of the financial guidance you've given us with respect to new revenue sources. So this plan provides for less than the one that you approved 5 years ago, because the assumptions are not in there any longer, having to do with additional gas taxes and additional sales taxes. So that accounts for a lot.
Exactly, and that $4 to $5 billion difference was really coming from the charter county, which was really our transit operation and capital building funds. So that's where we'll see the biggest, change. So getting right into the transit element and getting right into the transit funds, $15 billion over the lifetime of the plan, but we're still forecasting $7 billion for transit. So if we looked at our transportation funding as kind of a portfolio, and we're spending almost half of our portfolio on transit operations, but then what do we get for that $7 billion? And that's what I'm going to cover here momentarily. Looking at operations of existing transit fixed route service, 42%, 41.59 comes from the local funding partners. So they play a major and critical role in fixed route transit service. But as we move forward with premium levels of transit service, the local commitment definitely greatens, especially as it relates to operating the facilities. The federal and state play a major role, but when it comes to fare box recovery, what we get back from user fees, those customer fares, we're looking at 23, 25%, and that's within the norm, up to 30%. So we have a lot of transit projects, and a lot of them came out of the work of the 2030 long-range plan. We do kind of a historical compilation of the different studies, corridor studies, alternative analyses, feasibility studies that are ongoing. And we look at and we kind of compile those into our transit vision or our transit needs. Some call it the transit desires. What do we want as it relates to transit, especially relating to premium transit service? And you'll see everything here from FlexBus in Seminole County to the private sector high-speed rail projects, to the different alternative analyses that are going on currently, whether it's State Road 50, the OI refresh connecting the convention center, with the I-Drive corridor, as well as US 441 connecting the Eustis Lake County area into the downtown Orlando area. So we set priorities. We set regional priorities. But how are regional priorities funded? And that's a really important note to make. We set regional priorities, but they are funded locally. So we may have, a number one regional priority, and it might be, one specific county's priority. But if there's not a funding source for that county to implement their priority, of course, we're going to have to go down to the next, into the next. One county, I'm guessing, and you can discuss this, but I doubt one county wants to use their money to build a project in another county. There might be some legal requirements on that as well. So what we're assuming is, based on the revenue that's coming in, based on the priorities that we have, the projects that will be cost feasible. As you see here in the 2030 long-range plan, the OI refresh, the connection between Medical City, the Orlando Airport, and the Convention Center was the #1 priority. There's been a lot of discussion over the past 6 months, and even at the opening ceremonies for Sunrail, talking about getting Sunrail to the airport, Sunrail Phase 3, Meadowwood Station to the future intermodal terminal at Orlando International Airport. Given all the discussion, the excitement, and kind of the expeditious fashion that project is moving in, we see that being kind of the #1 regional transit priority, of course, unless this board says differently. But given the excitement of Sunrail and really providing that rail transit connection to the airport in a timely fashion, not in 15 or 20 years, that really is our short-term opportunity to get to the airport. Limo, north-south.
Alex, for a second, another reason why that changed that I wanted to call to your attention, again, this is guidance we think we've got correct. But another late-breaking development since the last long-range plan was approved was the advent of the All Aboard Florida project. So that was introduced, and our commitment to the OIA intermodal terminal. This service would feed the intermodal terminal, proving an even higher return on that investment. So those are two important things in addition to the items that Alex mentioned that have changed since the last long-range plan was approved. That's why our recommendation to you is that move up, getting to the airport.
Great point, Harry. We also have a lot of the alternatives analyses that are going on without, a locally preferred alternative identified yet. The studies are still ongoing, and it's going to be 6 to 10 to maybe a year before we find out what are the results, what is the operations, what's the project really going to be. Is it going to be bus, local bus, light rail, trolley? What's the project going to be? During an alternatives analysis, we do find out, and we kind of get into those details, and those are ongoing, and we'll get back to you on those details as they come. Though we do have to make some assumptions in the long-range plan. We make funding assumptions, we make land use, population, and employment assumptions, but we also have to make some transit operations assumptions, especially as some of those major projects don't really have a project distilled quite yet. So we are making some operational assumptions as it relates to State Road 50, 441, as well as the OI refresh. We are using the Links 2030 vision, which this board saw maybe over a year now, probably 2 years ago now, which was adopted as part of the transit element we presented a few months back. We've refreshed and updated all the socioeconomic information and redid the technical data-driven analysis, which really showed us transit supportiveness, and based on the land use and population, what would that corridor be ready for and support effectively. We also have some of the other local projects, whether it's the Kissimmee Circulator, providing an improved mobility within the city of Kissimmee's multimodal transportation district, as well as providing some additional connectivity to their Sunrail stations. FlexBus we've heard a lot about. That's also in our blueprint and our transportation needs. And we have a lot of discussions with our partners, our counterparts to the south in Polk County. They really want to see some type of transit connection to Polk County. When it comes to private investment, there is a lot of unknowns when it comes to private developer or private operations. All Aboard Florida, and whether it's American Maglev or whatever comes out of that OIA to iDrive connection, it is in there. Of course, we do document private funds within the long-range plan, but we'll see kind of the implementation timeline on those projects here. We've heard a lot. We've given this presentations to all of our committees, and Cynthia and Marianne in their public outreach have talked these points to the public, and we've heard a lot. CAC, as they mentioned as Mr. Hanlon mentioned in his comments, there's not enough funding. We need a dedicated source. From the public outreach, we really heard people want options. We need alternative ways of getting from A to B. Mac, as the mayor's mentioned, it's unacceptable to assume that Link's operations, the fixed route services, as it's going to be today, and similarly with Sunrail. So basically, and I'll cover this in a second, what we have today is what we're forecasting for the future. I'm not saying that that's adequate, but what I am saying is based on the funding sources that we have to make the most of them. And if we had more, we would have more projects. But based on the funding assumptions we have, I'll show you the projects that we can afford. this is kind of what we heard, in a nutshell. We have desires, we have a vision, but the funding's not there to make it happen. And with that being said, we really need to, move forward with that understanding. And if we want these premium transit services or projects in general, no matter the mode, we have to be willing to pay for them. So when it comes to cost-feasible transit in the long-range plan, all these numbers here are in millions, and it's really important to note this is the local match only. Of course, there is a federal and state match when it comes to premium transit operations or transit operations in general, but we're just focusing on the local match, because if we don't have the local match, we can't even attempt to get the federal and state match. So this is kind of what we have. When it comes to Sunrail, we do have commitments, and that's in the interlocal operating agreement. So we're counting that as, not to say dedicated revenue, but there are commitments to funding Sunrail operations through the lifetime of the plan. So after that, after we say there's commitments to Sunrail, we have $2.3 billion over the lifetime of the plan. And then we look at Link's existing service. What's operating today, 2014. That's feeder bus, that's the different routes that they have, limo north-south, east-west, the routes throughout the region, a very large service area, $2 billion, almost $2.1 billion to provide that over the lifetime of the plan. The service, we're forecasting to say the same, and in the eye of the beholder of adequacy. But the costs increase dramatically, almost 100% given inflation, kind of net present value. So with that being said, we have 2.3, and you subtract 2.1 off the top, and what do you have? We have about $196 million over a 21-year period. Not a lot of money when you think about a 3-county region, and that's 196 over 21 years. So you do some simple division, you have about $7 to $8 million a year throughout the region. What can you do with $7 to $8 million a year? Put a little transit out there, or do you let it accrue and roll over to do something more premium? And that's what we're forecasting here. So once you see, our commitments to funding Link's existing service, funding Sunrail Phase 3 at a very conservative, kind of not to say ballpark estimate, but a very conservative estimate. There's going to be a study that will have to kind of refine those estimates, but based on our methodology, we're forecasting about $43 million over the lifetime of the plan, and that's going to be operating similar to Sunrail service. It's going to be, in the peak and in the off-peak, similar to the existing operations. You can't, run a special shuttle if you're not having, the other route, take its place. 192, BRT, there's a locally preferred alternative, and we've costed that out, the local match over the lifetime of the plan. And there is dedicated funding for that, or dedicated revenue based on the Osceola County funding assumptions. They're dedicated ad revenue, especially the Charter County sales tax. It's really going to make that project viable and cost feasible. Though it's important to note, as Commissioner Delary mentioned, if the sales taxes don't come true, if at the ballot box the voters do not pass these taxes, these projects don't get implemented either. There's a very clear and direct correlation between funding and implementing projects, and we have to be totally aware of that. OI Refresh is another project that is ongoing as it relates to an alternatives analysis, and there's not a locally preferred alternative identified yet, though given our refresh or Link's 2030 vision refresh data, we're forecasting a BRT on that corridor. Once a locally preferred alternative is identified through that alternatives analysis process, we may or may not need to amend the plan, though it's important to note if we do amend the plan and it's a transit service above and beyond BRT, say it's light rail, and we're forecasting about $111 million, say it's light rail, you're going into the billions. It won't be cost feasible unless there's a funding source to make it cost feasible. Kissimmee Circulator is another project that will be cost feasible based on the funding assumptions, and that provides, as I mentioned earlier on, some transit connectivity within the downtown Kissimmee multimodal district. Looking at the Link's TDP, and if you actually go to your packet, there's some operational assumption notes in there where you can actually see some of the nuances as it relates to the operations of the projects and how we costed them out. But when it comes to the TDP, you can see some of the projects there, about $1.5 million, as well as providing enhanced express on the US 441 corridor. It was important to note in the 2030 long-range plan, we forecasted that being a commuter rail. That was a policy decision by the board to, identify that as a commuter rail from Eustis to the downtown area with an assumed cost. And based on the 2030 resources, we had the money to make that happen. With the alternatives analysis ongoing, based on our kind of methodology, we're forecasting enhanced express, which is basically express bus, kind of rubber tire commuter rail, I guess you could say, with a more premium type of vehicle, maybe an over-the-road coach and some of the more premium amenities, whether it's Wi-Fi or other things. TDP as well, some minor improvements in Orange and Seminole counties will also make it below the line. As you see, after we fund the Orange County priorities, we have about $11 million left. In Seminole County's TDP, the way we costed those projects out, it's 12.28. When we're rounding millions, when you're looking at multi-billion-dollar plans, you I hate to say it, and I wish I had this problem with my personal finances, but you lose millions in rounding. And that's why we see that kind of being, above the line, but everything below, will not make the cost feasible plan, though it will be in our transit blueprint and our transit needs. So as funding becomes available, projects can then be moved, above the line and be moved into the cost feasible network. But as you see, the cost of these projects is about $4.5 billion, and that's in year of expenditure. So the longer we wait to implement these projects, the more they cost based on inflation. And as you can see, the revenue that we have is about 2.5, so we do have a pretty significant gap. But as Harry mentioned early on in the 2030 financial resources, we had a lot of charter county sales tax in there and being implemented basically immediately after the adoption of the plan. So that really allowed all these projects. And if I was standing here 5 years ago, I would have said we could have it all. But we can't, and it is not adequate. But it's based on the revenues that we have. Here's how the assumptions and the priorities shake out. And it's really important to note that, we do need more dedicated funding. And, there's been a lot of talk about that, whether it's a task force, and there's going to be, a presentation later on the agenda to talk about that as well. But, it's really important to note that these projects, the planning is there, the studies are there, the money is not. So getting to the highway network, the roadway network, this is a little more straightforward, a little more familiar to most of us. And giving the funding sources and funding categories at the federal and state level, this program meters itself for the most part. There's a lot of funding categories and funding pots that are really dedicated to roadway, right-of-way acquisition and roadway design and roadway, advanced construction. There's a lot of funds when it comes to this program. Local funds, we can change it up and we can use them to implement the true vision of this region. But as it comes to setting long-range priorities or establishing needs and deficiencies within the network, we work with our long-range plan subcommittee as well as our land use subcommittee to really develop, a land use forecast, which this board adopted, last August. So we use that, we load it into our travel demand model, and we start forecasting deficiencies. And then based on that, we look at, how do we improve? How do we want to fix these? What is the solution? Is it add a lane? Is it add more transit? But in many cases, as that paradigm shift is changing, as we're moving people versus cars, the design and planning of our roadways is changing as well. You've heard a lot of talk about context-sensitive solutions and complete streets, and that will continue into the future, and you'll see that as it relates to the project types in the long-range plan as well. But we do develop cost estimates for all these different types of solutions or the fixes that we're trying to use, and then based on revenues, similar to as we did with transit, we have to afford them. So we have to draw a line somewhere based on the funding assumptions, and then we establish our cost feasible network. Part of the modeling is that we look at travel patterns, we look at origins and destinations. How are people getting from A to B? And this is model driven, so it's it's not perfect, but it's a good way to start looking at where are trips going from A to B, based on based on productions and attractions. This is where people are going, and you'll see a lot of through trips to the region, whether it's on the Turnpike or on I-4, but still there's a lot of intra-regional trips that happen. But it's, I think, a good point to make here. As you see, we have a lot of trips coming into the region from outside our three-county area, and it's real important to note that, our region is the central business district, really for the Central Florida area beyond our three-county area. So we forecast efficiencies. What are our needs, based on current and future volumes? We have congestion now, we build in the future, and we're still going to have congestion even with our multi-billion-dollar improvements. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Congestion is a sign of the economy. Transportation, is the economy in motion in many cases. And we want to focus on moving people instead of cars. And the emphasis has really been about transit and bike ped. But again, we want to make sure we have the funding to implement those transit and bicycle and pedestrian type projects. So when it comes to the roadway capital, here's how we're forecasting it. It's at $7.6 billion over the lifetime of the plan, based on the financial assumptions that we've reached with our local funding partners. Other major projects in the long-range plan that I'm not going to spend too much time on because we've had many detailed presentations in the past. Wekiva Parkway, the financing plan, is in the cost-feasible long-range plan, as well as the I-4 Ultimate, as well as the segments north of the Ultimate going to Volusia County, similarly connecting into Polk County as well. The Osceola County Expressway Master Plan will also be part of the cost-feasible plan based on the toll funding assumptions. The bond financing will make those projects cost-feasible, and we've worked with the Osceola County Expressway to kind of work up those numbers. As it relates to local projects and projects in general, I mentioned, definition of need and type of projects, really important to note before I get into this. Not all projects are equal. You could have 100 projects that cost $1 million, or you could have 100 projects that cost, $70 to $80 million a piece. So when you look at these numbers, it's not a true quantitative analysis, but you can at least see, based on the number of projects that we're forecasting for improvements, how many we can actually afford to do. And with Orange County, there's 161 needs as it relates to city and county projects, and based on the financial resources, only 40 of them are able to be funded. In Osceola County, based on the funding assumptions that are being made, they can afford to build all of their 122 projects, and then they can go back to their federal and state lists and help the DOT and Federal Highway build some of those projects as well, expedite and advance those projects. So we're seeing a lot of projects being implemented in Osceola County, but again, contingent on those sales tax revenues being generated and accruing over the lifetime of the plan. Seminole as well, 24 projects were identified. Based on our preliminary analysis, 22 of them are cost feasible. And a lot of this is based on, again, similar to Osceola County, the infrastructure sales tax in Seminole County. So as those projects, or if that source does not come true, we'll have to amend the plan and pull some of these projects, so there'll be a bigger gap between needs and cost feasible. I have covered a lot of information, but I'm going to kind of end it on this topic here. We focus on funding and on projects in the long-range plan, but there's also a lot of policy focus. And safety is a major component of the long-range plan and a major component of the business that we do here at Metro Plan Orlando. And safety is really multifaceted. There's planning, there's design, there's education, there's enforcement. And we've heard all about it. But what can Metro Plan Orlando do beyond its support and financial support of some of these organizations? And so we're looking into the long-range plan about developing a regional complete streets policy, and that will be something that will take place after the adoption of the long-range plan. A lot of our municipalities do have complete streets policies, but we want to see how we can provide kind of that regional extension to provide some type of regional complete streets policy to design our facilities differently. Transit corridor preservation is also a critical one. As you look at the cost feasible projects, it's going to take a long time, 15, 20 years before we can accrue the funds to actually implement the project. So in the interim, we want to make sure those projects are not jeopardized by a short-term improvement. So we want to preserve those corridors for the future if we want to consider them a high-emphasis transit corridor. So that's something really important to note. Technology and innovation in the transportation system is also going to play a major role in this long-range plan, but more into the next long-range plans in the future, whether it's integrated corridor management, smart facilities, smart cars, automated vehicles, and data. Data can help us plan better. Data can help our system react better to existing conditions. And of course, education outreach across the board, whether it's relating to safety, but also funding. We see across the board in our outreach that there is a gap between the understanding of how transportation is funded and kind of the value perceived of the transportation system. So we've covered a lot of information, and we're going to cover more next month, and we'll be seeking your approval. In the interim, we will be holding a public hearing, as Cynthia mentioned, but next time we talk, we will be requesting approval of the long-range plan. Following that, we have about 90 days to finalize all of our documentation, and we'll have that submitted well in advance of that 90-day standard. But that's kind of all I have to cover today. I'd be more than happy to field any questions if you have any. If not, thank you for your time.
Alex, thank you very much for your presentation.